All right, you bastards, buckle up. Today we're diving headfirst into this shit show. U.S.-China relations.
Oh, boy.
Let's cut the crap. These two have been at each other's throats for ages, and it's about damn time we figure out why. We've got a badass expert in the house to break it all down. So get ready for some serious truth bombs.
Looking forward to it.
They'll cover the history,
Yeah.
the economics, and all the fucked up tension between these two superpowers.
Yeah.
You know, the stuff that actually matters to your sorry ass.
Well, it's a relationship that impacts all of us, that's for sure. And it's way more complicated than most people realize.
Damn straight. So, let's rewind the clock back to the 1800s, when these two first started sizing each other up. Those capitalist asshats in the U.S. were always looking for a quick buck, right?
Well, the Treaty of Wangxi in 1845 really set the stage.
Mm.
The U.S. was all about expanding its trade with China, seeing it as a massive untapped market.
So basically, they wanted to exploit the shit out of China, just like every other empire back then.
You could say that. That economic motivation continued to be a major factor in U.S.-China relations for decades.
And then we had that whole Boxer Rebellion clusterfuck in 1900. Wasn't that a total bloodbath?
It was a significant turning point. The Boxers were pissed off about foreign influence and Christianity in China, and they decided to take matters into their own hands. The U.S., along with other world powers, sent troops to crush the rebellion. They saw it as a direct threat to their economic interests.
They weren't about to let some pissed-off peasants screw up their money-making schemes. They were all about that open-door policy, right? So they could keep selling their shit to China without any competition.
Exactly. The U.S. wanted equal access to Chinese markets for all foreign powers. They didn't want any one country to have a monopoly. But the thing is, that open-door policy, while seemingly fair on the surface, really just masked the U.S.'s desire to dominate the Chinese market. It laid the groundwork for future economic tensions and resentment, which we see playing out even today.
Damn. So those sneaky bastards were playing the long game, huh? But hold on, didn't they team up during World War II? That's got to count for something, right?
They did. The U.S. supported China in its fight against Japan during World War II. It was a brief period of cooperation, driven by a common enemy. But once the war ended in 1935, things went south pretty quickly.
Yeah, because that's when the whole damn Cold War kicked off.
Yeah.
Communists versus capitalists. The ultimate showdown.
Right. The Chinese Civil War reignited, and in 1949, the Communists, led by Mao Zedong, won and established the People's Republic of China. The U.S., which had been backing the nationalists, refused to recognize the PRC and continued to support the nationalist government that fled to Taiwan. This move essentially solidified the divide between the two countries, setting the stage for decades of mistrust and hostility.
Talk about a pissing contest.
Yeah.
What happened next? Did they just glare at each other across the Pacific?
Things got pretty heated, especially with the Korean War in 1950.
Oh, yeah. That one was a real nail-biter.
Yeah?
Tell us more about China's role in that whole mess.
Well,
Wow.
when North Korea, backed by China, invaded South Korea, which was backed by the U.S., it triggered a major international crisis. The U.S. and its allies intervened under the UN flag, and China saw this as a direct threat to its security. They were worried about the U.S. expanding its influence right up to their border, potentially encircling them.
So they jumped into the fight to kick some American ass.
Pretty much. They sent millions of soldiers to fight alongside the North Koreans, and it turned into a bloody stalemate that lasted for 3 years.
Yeah.
The Korean War was a brutal wake-up call for the U.S., demonstrating that China was willing to fight tooth and nail to protect its interests. It also solidified China's image as a major player on the world stage, no longer content to be pushed around by Western powers.
Damn. They weren't messing around. You mentioned they were freaked out by the U.S. Got any juicy details to back that up?
Actually, yeah, over 60% of Chinese POWs taken during the Korean War believed they were fighting to defend China from the U.S., not just to support North Korea. That tells you something about the level of fear and animosity that existed at the time.
That's some hardcore shit right there. So after Korea, did things chill out at all?
Not really. China also backed North Vietnam during the Vietnam War in the 60s, which pissed off the U.S. even more. The U.S. was obsessed with containing communism, and China saw those efforts as a direct threat for decades. The U.S. tried to isolate China diplomatically, even blocking them from joining the United Nations.
It was basically a giant dick measuring contest for years, just pure animosity fueled by ideology and paranoia.
Pretty much. But then something totally unexpected happened in the early 70s.
Hold up. Is this where shit gets really interesting?
You bet. In 1972, President Nixon, that anti-communist hardliner, decided to visit China.
Nixon. Are you shitting me? Nobody saw that coming. It's like finding out your grandma's a dominatrix.
It was a total shock to the world. But there were a few things that led to this insane move. First, China and the Soviet Union had a falling out, and the U.S. saw a chance to exploit that rift. Second, the U.S. wanted to gain leverage in its negotiations with the Soviets, and cozying up to China was a way to do that. And let's not forget, Nixon was a shrewd political operator. He knew this move would make him look like a visionary leader, a man who could transcend Cold War divisions.
So it's all about playing those Cold War power games.
To a large extent, yes. But it also showed that both sides realized that the constant hostility wasn't doing anyone any favors, the world was changing, and they needed to adapt.
So, after Nixon's trip, did they suddenly become BFFs, sharing beers and swapping stories about their grandkids?
Not quite. It did, however, pave the way for the two countries to finally establish official diplomatic relations in 1979. The U.S. finally recognized the PRC as the only legitimate government of China, which was a huge fucking deal.
Well, let's be real. There were still some major issues, right? Like that whole Taiwan situation,
Yeah.
which is basically a giant powder keg waiting to explode.
Yeah, absolutely. The U.S. continued to provide military support to Taiwan, which pissed China off to no end.
Yeah.
They saw it as meddling in their internal affairs, and it remains a major point of contention even today. The relationship that emerged after normalization was a messy mix of cooperation and competition, full of contradictions and potential for conflict.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster waiting to happen. So.
Oh.
What about Tiananmen Square in 1989? Didn't that fuck things up royally?
It definitely did. The brutal crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square shocked the world and triggered widespread condemnation of the Chinese government. The U.S. responded with sanctions and put a freeze on high-level talks.
Yeah, that was a major turning point. Public opinion in the U.S. turned against China big time, right?
For sure. There was a growing sense of distrust and hostility. The Clinton administration tried to balance human rights concerns with their economic interests, but it was a tricky balancing act.
So, things basically went from bad to worse. Where the hell did they go from there?
Well, then 9/11 happened, and that shook up U.S. foreign policy in a major way. Suddenly, terrorism became the U.S.'s top priority, and that had a surprising impact on their relationship with China.
Yeah, terrorism was like the new boogeyman, and everyone was freaking out.
Right.
So how did that whole 9/11 thing affect things with China? Did they suddenly become best buddies in the fight against evil?
Well, it led to this weird temporary alignment, believe it or not. Both countries saw terrorism as a shared threat, and China even offered some support for the U.S.'s war on terror.
Wait, so they were on the same side for once?
Yeah.
That's kind of mind-blowing, considering all the shit they'd been through.
It was a strange time for sure. But even with this common enemy, there was still a ton of tension simmering beneath the surface. China was really wary of the U.S. beefing up its military presence in Central Asia, and they were definitely not thrilled about the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Yeah, that whole Iraq war thing was a total shit show. Speaking of which, didn't China use that distraction to their advantage? Like, while the U.S. was busy getting bogged down in the Middle East, China was busy making moves in their own backyard.
You're absolutely right. The Iraq War gave China a golden opportunity to assert its influence in the region. They started flexing their economic muscles, making deals, and building relationships with countries that were traditionally aligned with the U.S. It was a pretty shrewd move on their part.
Sneaky bastards. But hold on, didn't we have that whole G2 bullshit going on during the Obama years? Like, the U.S. and China were supposed to be the world's power couple, solving all the world's problems together.
There was definitely a lot of talk about G2 or Chimerica after the 2008 financial crisis. The idea was that the U.S. and China, as the world's two largest economies, would work together to address global challenges like climate change and economic instability.
It sounds like some hippy-dippy fantasy, to be honest. Like, those two could never actually get their shit together and cooperate on anything meaningful.
Well, you're not entirely wrong. It was a very complex situation, full of contradictions. There were potential benefits to collaboration, sure, but at the same time, their rivalry was becoming more and more intense. They were competing for resources, influence, and technological dominance.
So basically, they were like a couple in a toxic relationship, constantly fighting and making up, but never really trusting each other.
That's a pretty accurate analogy. And then,
Right.
of course, we had the Trump era, which threw everything into chaos.
Ah, yes. The Donald. Let's talk about that trade war bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
That was like watching a reality TV show gone wrong, with tariffs flying back and forth like insults.
Trump took a very aggressive approach toward China. He slapped tariffs on Chinese goods, accused them of currency manipulation, and basically tried to cripple their economy.
He was like a bull in a china shop, smashing everything in sight. What the hell was his game plan anyway?
Well, Trump believed that China was taking advantage of the U.S. stealing jobs and undermining American businesses. He wanted to force them to change their trade practices and make concessions, but his tactics were pretty reckless, and they ended up hurting both economies.
It was like a game of economic chicken, with both sides refusing to back down. And then we had the whole COVID-19 pandemic on top of everything else, which just poured gasoline on the fire.
The pandemic definitely made things a whole lot worse. Both countries were blaming each other for the virus, and the rhetoric got really nasty. It was a prime example of how distrust and animosity can escalate quickly, especially in times of crisis.
Yeah, those were some dark times for sure. So what about Biden? Has he managed to calm things down at all? Or is it just the same old shit, different president?
The Biden administration initially tried to stabilize relations. There were some high-level meetings and attempts at dialogue, but it's been a rocky road with tensions flaring up again recently.
Those two just can't seem to catch a break, can they? So what's at the root of all this tension? Is it just about economics? Or is there something deeper going on?
Economics is definitely a huge factor. These two are the world's biggest trading partners. And that creates this complicated web of interdependence. They rely on each other's markets. But they're also vulnerable to each other's economic policies. Then you have China's history of currency manipulation, which has pissed off a lot of people in the U.S.
Yeah, nobody likes a cheater.
Yeah.
So are they headed for a full-blown economic divorce? Like, are we going to see a complete decoupling of the two economies?
There's a lot of talk about decoupling, but it's way more complicated than just flipping a switch. Their economies are so intertwined that separating them would be incredibly difficult and painful for both sides. Imagine trying to untangle two giant balls of yarn that have been knitted together for decades. It would be a total mess.
Yeah. That sounds like a recipe for economic chaos. But it's not just about money, right? There are also some serious strategic and geopolitical issues at play here.
Exactly. China's growing military power and their increasingly aggressive stance in the region have been setting off alarm bells all over the place, especially in the U.S. It's like watching a goddamn dragon flexing its muscles and claiming its territory.
So where are the biggest flashpoints? Like, what are they actually fighting about?
Well, the South China Sea is a major source of tension. China's been building artificial islands and military bases in these disputed waters, basically saying, this is our shit, and you can't do anything about it.
That takes some serious balls. I bet the U.S. isn't just going to sit back and watch, right?
Of course not. The U.S. sees freedom of navigation in the South China Sea as vital to their interests, and they've been sending warships through the area to challenge China's claims. It's a dangerous game of chicken, with the potential for a miscalculation leading to a full-blown military conflict.
Jesus Christ. That sounds terrifying. So we've got a potential trade war, a possible naval showdown in the South China Sea, and then there's that whole Taiwan situation, which is like a ticking time bomb. Anything else we should be shitting our pants about?
Well, there's also the whole cyber warfare thing. Both countries are constantly hacking into each other's systems, stealing intellectual property, and engaging in all sorts of digital espionage. It's like a goddamn spy thriller playing out in the virtual world.
And don't forget about the human rights issue. China's record on that front is pretty abysmal. And it's a constant source of friction with the U.S.
You're right. The U.S. has been very vocal in its criticism of China's crackdown on dissent, its persecution of religious minorities, and its lack of political freedom. But so far, all the talk hasn't really changed anything.
What the fuck does the future hold for these two titans? Are they headed for a full-blown showdown? Or can they figure out a way to share the sandbox without destroying everything in sight? I mean, this shit is making my head spin.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, it's impossible to predict with any certainty. What's clear is that we're entering a period of intense competition and rivalry between the U.S. and China. It's going to require some serious diplomacy and a willingness to compromise on both sides if they want to avoid a catastrophic conflict.
Compromise from those two.
Yeah.
That sounds about as likely as finding a unicorn riding a grizzly bear while juggling chainsaws.
I know, it's a long shot. But there are also areas where cooperation is possible, even necessary. Think about climate change, global pandemics, and nuclear proliferation. These are challenges that no single country can tackle alone.
Okay, so maybe there's a glimmer of hope amidst all this doom and gloom. But this shit is complicated as hell, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all. So is there anything else we should know about this whole U.S.-China mess? It feels like we've only scratched the surface of this shit.
Well, one thing people often forget is that this relationship isn't just about governments and politicians. It's also about regular people, businesses, and cultural exchange.
Yeah, You got tons of Chinese students in the U.S. and Americans living and working in China. Isn't that supposed to help build bridges and all that crap?
In theory, yes. Those people-to-people connections can foster understanding and break down stereotypes. But let's be real, there's also a ton of suspicion and distrust between the two countries. Just look at all the drama surrounding Huawei and TikTok.
Oh, yeah. That shit was wild. The U.S. government basically accused those companies of being Chinese spies.
Yeah.
And now everyone's freaking out about their data being stolen. It's like a digital Cold War or some shit.
Those cases have definitely fueled tensions and accusations of espionage and unfair competition. The U.S. has taken steps to restrict the use of technology from Chinese companies like Huawei and TikTok, claiming it's a matter of national security. But China sees it as the U.S. trying to stifle their technological advancement and
everything else. So what does this all mean for regular folks like us? Should we be stocking up on ramen noodles and building bunkers in our backyards?
I wouldn't go that far just yet, but it's important to be aware of the risks. This rivalry could lead to economic instability, political uncertainty, and even military conflict, which would obviously have a huge impact on everyone.
So basically, we're all fucked if these two assets can't get their shit together.
It's not a hopeless situation, but it's definitely a challenging one. There are things that can be done to reduce the risk and promote a more constructive relationship.
All right. I'm all ears. Give us some hope, Doc. What can be done to prevent these two from blowing up the world?
First off, both sides need to improve communication and dialogue. They need to actually listen to each other's concerns and find areas where they can cooperate, instead of just yelling at each other and flexing their muscles.
Yeah, that whole talking thing seems like a good idea.
What?
And let's be real. Those two have a serious communication problem. It's like they're speaking different languages, both literally and figuratively.
That's true. There are huge cultural and political differences that make communication difficult, but it's not impossible. They need to find ways to bridge those gaps and build some trust. That means being transparent about their intentions, sticking to international agreements, and avoiding actions that could provoke the other side.
So basically, they need to grow the fuck up and act like responsible adults instead of squabbling children.
Exactly. They need to realize that this us versus them mentality is incredibly dangerous, and that cooperation is the only way to address the global challenges we're facing.
All right. So let's say they manage to avoid a full-blown war. What's the best-case scenario here? Can they actually learn to coexist peacefully? Or are we stuck with this constant tension and rivalry for the foreseeable future?
The ideal outcome would be a relationship based on mutual respect, cooperation in areas of common interest, and healthy competition in others. Think of it like a friendly rivalry between two athletes. They push each other to be better, but they also respect the rules of the game and recognize that they're ultimately part of the same team.
That sounds pretty utopian, Doc. But hey, I can dream, right?
It's definitely a challenging goal, but it's not impossible. It's going to require vision, leadership, and a willingness to compromise on both sides. But the alternative, a world consumed by conflict between the U.S. and China, is too terrifying to contemplate.
Well said, Doc. You've given us a lot to think about. So any final words of wisdom before we wrap this up? Anything our listeners should keep in mind as they navigate this crazy world?
Yeah. I think it's crucial to avoid simplistic narratives and easy answers when it comes to the U.S. and China. This relationship is full of nuances, contradictions, and competing interests. It's easy to get caught up in the fear and rhetoric, but it's important to stay informed, think critically, and engage in thoughtful discussions about these issues.
All right. So basically, do your homework, folks.
Yeah.
Don't just believe everything you hear on the news or from those talking heads on TV. This shit is complex, and it deserves your attention.
Exactly. The future of the U.S.-China relationship, and indeed, the future of the world, depends on it.
That's some heavy shit.
Yeah.
Well, folks, there you have it. The U.S. and China, two superpowers.
Yeah.
A whole lot of baggage. And an uncertain future. Stay tuned, because this shit show is far from over.